Near the end of Donald Trump's administration, he passed an executive order barring many elements of critical race theory trainings in the federal government. He also barred contracting companies that used these similar trainings. The media screamed that Trump was banning diversity trainings, but that's a manipulation. They weren't telling you what was actually going on. They were using clever words and false framing to make it seem like Donald Trump was a bigot, when in reality, many of these programs outright violated the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't reach beyond the news and you just believe what you hear on TV, which is probably not many of you, if any at all, well, then you're just going to believe it. Donald Trump is a bigot and he's pushing the far right white supremacist ideals. But if you actually look into what his executive order was and what was going on, you'd realize Donald Trump was correct. You see, I rag on Democrats a whole lot on this channel. And for this, many people say, Tim is conservative or he's right wing. But in fact, I'm actually not. Recently tweeted that Joe Biden's progressive income tax doesn't go far enough. Well, actually, I did a Futurama reference saying it doesn't go too far enough. In fact, I'm pretty left on many issues. But I take specific issue with media deceptions and the pushing of agendas, which I view to be overtly racist. Segregation is back. It's getting worse. It's been getting worse. And I and many others have been talking about this for years. It is not the Republican Party pushing segregation, race-based training, and overt racism. There are certainly some elements of the right in the Republican Party. Many of these individuals have been excised from the party. However, it is the Democrats that seem to be doing everything in their power to bring back racism and segregation, and I am going to show you definitively and prove it. You see, I view the Republicans as stagnant and obstructionist. I'm not a fan of Mitch McConnell or the Republican Party leadership because not only do I disagree with many of the Republican Party policies, they don't fight for anything anyway. So there's nothing to really be upset about other than they're obstructionist. Okay, they do have some policy positions I disagree with. They've tried to push, but for the most part, what do they do? The Democrats are on offense, and Donald Trump was on offense, and that was about it. There were some good things about Trump, many bad things, but the Democrats seem to be worse. There's a meme among conservatives that Democrats have long been the party of Jim Crow, segregation, slavery, etc. While this is historically true, you often get media outlets saying, yes, but the party's flipped, they've changed. Maybe, but I'm sorry if I just don't see it. It is the Democrats today pushing racial affinity groups, race-based segregation. It is blue cities. It is urban centers that are pushing these policies. And it typically is the Republicans saying no to this. Unfortunately, for most of us that disagree with segregation and violations of the Civil Rights Act, or who believe in Dr. King's dream, Republicans don't do anything to fight back, except, of course, for Donald Trump. We have the story from March 7th. U.S. Department of Education curbs decision on race-based affinity groups. Affinity groups are basically just racially segregated groups. Universities do this. Grade school, elementary schools do this. And they do it for very overt and racist reasons. And I'm going to show you. It's back. Segregation is getting worse. Columbia, just today, announced, we're learning, is hosting 6 separate graduation ceremonies based on income level, race, and ethnicities. Lindsey Graham, for all of his problems and everything I could criticize him for, slammed racial reparations in the COVID relief bill. My friends, let's read the news, but let me start by saying we will not solve the problem of racism by segregating the races and providing money to people based on race when the problems tend to be class-based and education-based. And I'll show you exactly what Biden is doing and why it's so insidious, and then we'll go through the news about what's happening with segregation expanding across the U.S. Before we get started, head over to timcast.com to become a member and get access to exclusive members-only podcast segments. We have a bunch of really great conversations. The other day, we talked about the collapse of the anti-SJW YouTubers and why it happened. And when you become a member at Timcast, you're providing that safety net for me and my company and my employees in the event that we get purged or banned. We will still be able to produce content, albeit the reach wouldn't be nearly as far, but at least we will still exist in some form. But don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Let me read you the story from the New York Post. They say, the U.S. Department of Education suspended a decision that found racial affinity groups discriminated against students and staff, the Post has learned. The goal of the programs used by the New York City public school system and other school districts is to separate students and staff by racial groups in order to help address discrimination and white privilege. But the practice of separating schools into racial groups is discriminatory, a determination obtained by the Post found. The findings, reached during the waning days of former President Trump's time in office in early January, were in response to a complaint about a Chicago area school district's racial equity training programs and lesson plans. Sources said the findings, if implemented, could apply to New York City and other school districts. The Post last year exclusively reported about city early childhood teachers being asked to be segregated into discussion groups based on skin color, race, and ethnicity following the George Floyd killing at the hands of Minneapolis police and the violent riots that followed after. They said protest. I'm correcting them. Critics ripped the initiative for perpetuating racial stereotypes. One Manhattan principal even asked parents to reflect on their whiteness to address white supremacy, white privilege, and discrimination. The 18-page letter of finding, drafted by the Federal Department of Education Office of Civil Rights Enforcement Director Carol Ashley, was triggered by a complaint filed by a former NYC arts teacher who now works in the Evanston-Skokie, Illinois school district. The DOE findings said the Evanston-Skokie school district violated civil rights law by separating administrators in a professional development training program in August 2019 into two groups based on race, white and non-white, offering various racially exclusive affinity groups that separated students, parents, and community members by race, implementing a disciplinary policy that included explicit direction to staffers to consider a student's race when meting out discipline, carried a colorism privilege walk that separated 7th and 8th grade students into different groups based on race. Quote, if you are white, take 2 steps forward. If you're a person of color with dark skin, take 2 steps back. If you're black, take 2 steps back, the privilege walk exercise said. The goal was for white students to learn more about white privilege, internalized dominance, microaggressions, and how to act as an ally for students of color, the lesson plan said. But Ashley of the DOE concluded the school district engaged in intentional race discrimination by coordinating and conducting racially exclusive affinity groups, which resulted in the separation of participants in distinct programs based on race in violation of the Title VI regulation. My friends, that is quite literally the 1964 Civil Rights Act. These urban districts, these Democratic politicians, these people in the Biden administration, they are absolutely reactionary, which means they are trying to bring us back to a time long since past, reacting to the change, the revolution brought about by the civil rights movement, which desegregated this country. When I was covering Ferguson and Baltimore riots, this was over the police killings of certain individuals, there were certain rooms in these organizing areas that were segregated for certain people of certain races. And I thought it was actually scary and shocking. They said it was a safe space only for people of color or the African diaspora. I thought segregation was wrong. We're supposed to be fighting to be one country, one people, one planet, one human race. Instead, you actually have people like Don Lemon on CNN demanding that people see color. I think it's fair to point out there are issues of racism that we need to deal with. I think it's important to point out that we should note these things. But to create government programs would still violate the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And honestly, it'll only make things worse. We've now brought ourselves to a point in this country where we have ended most of the racist programs and laws, if not all of them. Now, there are still remnants of this racism, but the solution here isn't to bring back racist policy or racial discrimination, though that's what the intersectional or identitarian left would want to do. That will only make things worse. Now, I can already tell, whenever I bring this up, there are many on the left who say, Tim, you are wrong. Affinity groups are a good thing. Let me break down for you the problems we have. And I want to show you this. Racial affinity groups from the anti-racist classroom in Sacramento City. And I want to read for you the first paragraph. I did cover this before, but in this context of what's happening with universities, it's important to bring up again for those that aren't familiar. This is from the Sacramento City anti-racist classroom document, which reads, racial affinity groups offer a structure of inquiry and can address many needs. They support us in exploring what has been forbidden, forgotten, and unhealed. For example, In racial affinity groups, white people can discover together their group identity. They can cultivate racial solidarity and compassion and support each other in sitting with the discomfort, confusion, and numbness that often accompany white racial awakening. They can also discern white privilege and its impact without the aid or dependence on people of color. White people who have formed racial affinity groups can report that they recognize their collective commonality and shared history, as well as the impact that their privilege has had on other races and on each racial affinity group member. They go on to say, while many POC may not need an affinity group to help them relate to their racial group membership, they may need to explore the diversity that exists among POC and across POC without having the distraction of having to educate white people on whiteness and its harm. What they're basically saying, they want different groups based on race. They would take all of the small white children and put them in a group to ask them to learn about their shared history. My question is, what do you think that shared history would be? And why would you just assume it would be inherently negative? Why would these young white people who get together and talk about their race despise their history or view it negatively? Why wouldn't they view it positively? My whole life, I grew up in a mixed race family. I've heard about the splendor, wonder, and advancements of European settlement in North America. I learned about atrocities and the Trail of Tears and really horrifying things, slavery, for instance. But typically we learn about the inventions, the developments, the technologies, the methodologies of the mostly, if not all, white founding fathers. And I mean expansively founding fathers. There were many people who I think contributed to the founding of this country well after the inception of this country and well before. And not all of those ideas came from white people. But for the most part, we are told historically it was the white founding fathers and their ideas. If you put these children into these groups and you follow a logical path, what would you discover? We are a great American melting pot. We are a great country with great ideals that has resulted in the most expansive set of civil rights for any country on the planet. And though we're far from perfect, we are probably one of the most tolerant societies in the world. And how did that happen? Why, it was the ideology of classical liberalism and the founding fathers who happen to be white. What happens then when you demonize, attack, and force these groups to have a racial awakening? They're not going to sit there in self-pity and say they hate themselves. Many might, and many others might actually just become white supremacists. Segregation is back. It is being pushed by Democrats, not Republicans, which brings me to the news from today that Columbia University is hosting 6 separate graduation ceremonies, with race and ethnicity being partly the defining factor in these different ceremonies. Fox News says Columbia University is planning to hold 6 additional graduation ceremonies for students according to their race and other aspects of how they identify. The New York City Schools website details graduation ceremonies for Native, Asian, Latinx, and Black students taking place for Columbia College, Columbia Engineering, General Studies, and Barnard College at the end of April. Another dubbed FLI graduation for first generation and or low income community. The school also hosts a lavender graduation for the LGBTIAQ plus community. Due to coronavirus restrictions, the ceremonies will take place online. It's unclear when the separate ceremonies were announced, but Sunday was the deadline for nominating individuals in Columbia College, Columbia Engineering, and General Studies for the Multicultural Affairs graduation cords. Columbia University did not immediately respond to a comment. Last month, Young America's Foundation flagged a white-only caucus event scheduled to take place at Elon University. It was intended to, quote, give white people a space to learn about and process their awareness of and complicity in unjust systems without harming their friends of color, according to an email distributed by the university. The university said the event was organized by a group of students and eventually did not take place because it would have been at odds with university policy. And don't forget, U.S. law. At University of Michigan, Dearborn, there was a big controversy over what they were calling cafes. They announced a white-only and non-white-only digital cafe where people could meet, gather, and talk about these things. Quite literally a racial affinity group. The events were canceled. The website was taken down. That's my understanding. It was interesting that the initial backlash shut down the website promoting a racially segregated gathering for white people and people who aren't white. If it was really about promoting diversity, wouldn't there be a multitude of racial affinity groups, more than just white and non-white? Maybe that's why it got taken down. Maybe that's why it was stopped. But now we're seeing quite literally the same thing across many different universities, and an advocacy for it coming from school districts and even Joe Biden's Department of Education. Let me show you some things. From Reason, they say, this is from August 24th, 2020. Yes, Black NYU students demanded segregated housing. No, the university didn't agree to it. Quote, NYU does not have and will not create student housing that excludes any student based on race. My question is, how long? How long until this falters? Like the other, POC cafe and non-POC cafe event they did, it eventually collapsed, and now they are doing racial affinity groups. How long until NYU does actually implement racially segregated dorms? From Forbes, November 15th, 2018. Racial segregation on American campuses, a widespread phenomenon. Forbes says, or I should say the author, Richard Vedder, says, the National Association of Scholars, a group mostly academics interested in higher education, issues only a few research reports annually. But what they lack in quantity, they make up in quality. Their studies are extremely carefully done, with well-documented research. A young NAS employee, Dion Pierre, has been researching the segregation of students on college campuses by race, special commencement exercises for African-American students, living and recreational facilities segregated by race, Black student unions, and so forth. These practices have existed for decades on some campuses, and rather than fading as racial prejudices decline, witness rapidly increasing interracial marriages, they are flourishing. The Pierre study, mostly completed, should be released around Martin Luther King Day in early 2019. All of this is terribly ironic. In 1954, in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, the U.S. Supreme Court effectively outlawed racial segregation in our schools. Angry whites, especially in the South, fought the attempt to integrate schools, often leading to violent protests, such as when James Meredith became the first Black student to enter the University of Mississippi in 1962. Civil rights leaders put their lives on the line working for a colorblind, non-race determined society. Most memorably, King, when he articulated his dream, where people, quote, will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The bitter struggle to break down racial distinctions in education lasted for decades. Yet now universities are reintroducing segregation, making race the primary determinant of student participation in some activities, such as Black student unions or race-based housing facilities. I may be biased, my friends, because many of you who are frequent viewers of my content know exactly why this has always freaked me out and why I've never been a fan of Democrat policy towards racial segregation and critical race theory. And it's because I come from a mixed race family, second generation. It's because I witnessed discrimination against my dad based on his race, even though he was part of an interracial marriage with interracial kids. He still faced detriment based on his race, which made no sense. We were anything but privileged. We were supposed to be this family that represented the future of this country that the progressives fought so hard for, that people like Dr. King in the civil rights era fought so hard for, that after Loving v. Virginia, we were finally supposed to be accepted and actually benefit from the great privileges of the society. But in fact, it was the progressives and the Democrats who fought so hard and are continuing to fight to make it all worse for people like me and my family. Meanwhile, you have many unwitting, dare I say, useful idiots who support this policy from Democrats, maybe because it grants them power or because they are actually white supremacists. Perhaps you don't agree and you don't believe me, but let me show you a statement and a comic to break down what is actually happening. Recently, Bill Burr, the comedian, was called racist. And it probably has to do a lot with his comedy, which is particularly offensive, but it stems from his appearance, I believe it was at the Grammys, I'm not sure, where he mispronounced a Latino woman's name. He just pronounced it poorly and he said, sorry if I'm butchering your name. Well, he was called racist. A woman on Twitter posted, Gen Z calling Bill Burr a racist, Bill Burr and his beautiful wife, Nia. Bill Burr is in fact married to a Black woman. And I don't think that matters. I think they are two people who love each other. Good for them. I'm glad. It's actually amazing that we can see how far we've come in terms of civil rights and where we are today in terms of accepting people who just love each other. However, a man named Claiborne Griffin, a verified Twitter user, tweeted this after this image saying, "While I'm not suggesting Bill Burr is racist, a white man having a non-white wife, so saith Claiborne Griffin, can sometimes be a sign of racism. So you shouldn't assume someone isn't racist just because they own," and this is his word, "a minority, we'll just say love servant. They may very well," and this is what Claiborne says, have one because they are racist." One of the most shocking displays of overt racism I have ever seen on this platform, and it's coming from someone purportedly on the progressive left. Now, of course, there are many progressives who push back on people like this and slam them. It's not indicative of every single person on the left, mind you, but it is enough. There are elements of the far right that are crazy and creepy, and I think, yes, that's enough to be criticized and to criticize what they believe. But I have no problem criticizing fringe far-right conspiracies, and I have no problem criticizing fringe far-left conspiracies. The issue is that while Trump may have emboldened some of these people, he has never been the establishment. He has never been the media, and he struggled to actually maintain any semblance of an administration when he was president. Many of his appointees turned on him. John Bolton was a dumb move who stabbed him in the back, and Trump struggled to get a lot done. The establishment political class, Democrats and Republicans, they push many narratives that we must be concerned with. And right now, and in the past several years, the past decade, it has been the establishment Democrats with tacit support from progressives pushing this ridiculous behavior. There are many dirtbag leftists, they call themselves, that I absolutely respect for calling out the wokeness, the critical race theory, and I love the memes. There was one, I think it was from Kyle Kalinske, a progressive, where it said something like, "We just want health care," and it was like the sad, depressed meme guy. And then Democrats offering up critical race theory. They think that by having a diverse military-industrial complex, progressives will just fall in line. But perhaps this is why we see censorship affecting the anti-war left as well as conservatives, those who push back on this psychotic orthodoxy and dogmatic cult-like behavior from the Democratic establishment that for some reason has always pushed for segregation. Maybe there was a brief fleeting moment for a couple of decades. I don't know. Maybe I was too young. But they were the party of segregation then, and today they are the party of segregation. So I will absolutely be calling them out because these are the ones who freak me out. Let me show you this meme image. There's a black man who says, this is an historic moment. People of color finally have a space safe from white privilege and discrimination. And there's a man putting up a sign who says, actually, this sign has been in the basement of the university for decades. And it's a sign where there is an ED scratched off of a certain word, and it says people of color dormitory. And they're pointing out the segregation was then, and it is being brought back now under a very similar name. It's the same thing. And I think it's fairly obvious if you pay attention and you're critical of this. The problem, I suppose, is that there are many people who are not paying attention. So while it may be obvious when you see them doing it, if you're a tribalist who goes along with this, if you're a dogmatist who believes in identitarianism, or you're a Democratic established politician, you're probably in favor of this because it gives you power. You can cancel those who disagree with you policy-wise. You can get your politician elected. You can accuse Trump of being racist. And I'll give you an example. Take a look at this from law.com. Trump executive order forcing cancellation of more diversity events, DOJ groups say. The dangerous consequences of suspending more than just trainings have already begun to play out. Groups for diverse staff at Justice Department have scrapped more events over concerns they would violate Trump's recent executive order prohibiting diversity and inclusion training. You see how insidious it is to call it diversity, but then actually advocate for students to be separated based on race? Isn't diversity when we have different ideas and we're people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds and identities? Isn't it diversity when we're all together working together? At what point did diversity come to mean racial segregation? It's semantics. It's doublespeak, straight out of 1984. They argue that segregation is diversity. They're doing it. And it's happening right in front of us, and it's only gotten worse. Maybe you've heard me talk about a lot of this stuff for some time. And maybe this is just an update for you because now we're seeing just how bad it's gotten. And I think it's going to continue to get bad. And I think those of us who believe in true classical or social liberalism, where the individual is protected, we're losing. Maybe we're not completely losing. Maybe the night is always darkest before the dawn. And what we're really seeing is that the more this kind of behavior happens, the more regular people are going to tune out, and these institutions will get woke and go broke. How many people actually want this? The scary thing to me is that it's likely there are, you know what? I'm going to say it. They try to argue that there are crypto fascists or crypto white nationalists. This guy Claiborne Griffin, for instance, on Twitter, he has made one of the most overtly white supremacist things I've ever seen. But I shouldn't call it most overt. I should say it's subversive. Telling you that someone in an interracial relationship may secretly be racist. It's insane. It absolutely is insane. Bill Burr is married to a beautiful woman. They look like they have a very loving relationship. And this woman slammed Claiborne, telling him to basically shove off. And absolutely, Bill Burr is an epic and amazing comedian. He's a rad dude. And I don't care about the race of him or his wife. I think he just does a good job. I'm glad he calls out the stuff when he does. He's not perfect. He tries to play it safe a little bit sometimes. And I think his wife seems like a very lovely and intelligent person. So what? Why would this guy say this? And how many more people exist like him who believe these things and are secretly pushing this while claiming to be on the left? It reminds me of the trope about the abusive male feminist. They claim to support women, but they're actually just trying to use feminism as a foot in the door to get in safe spaces with these women and then abuse them. And here we are today. We now have Lindsey Graham decrying what he calls reparations in the COVID relief bill. Hidden inside President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill is a special program that will dole out race-based cash to black farmers, says GOP Lindsey Graham. Quote, in this bill, if you're a farmer, your loan will be forgiven up to 120%. If you're African American, some other minority. But if you're a white person, no forgiveness. Why do that? Why tell a poor white person you are not entitled to being helped? Why should our taxes be segregated? We fought long and hard in this country to end the racism. And it is not the Republicans bringing it back. As much as I am no fan of Lindsey Graham, I can give him respect for calling out race-based programs that give money to people based on race. This should be outright illegal. But you take a look at Joe Biden's administration, and we'll bring it all together. The U.S. Department of Education suspended a decision that found racial affinity groups discriminated against students and staff. To put it mildly, it is now okay to discriminate against people based on race at these schools. And I am no fan, and I completely disagree with it. For his troubles, Lindsey Graham was slammed. The National Black Farmers Association calls for Graham to apologize over racist comments. If you criticize the government giving out money based on race, they'll call you racist. Here we are. Where does this all lead us? At a time when we are hyperpolarized, worse than we've ever been. At a time when it seems like we have no unifying culture. The Grammys ratings are down, Emmys are down, Super Bowl ratings are down. None of us are watching the same programs where our culture is fracturing. At a time when cultural stagnation is on the rise, movies are repetitive, redundant, repeats, adaptations. We also have an effort by the left and Democrats to separate people based on race. This may be the most divisive time in American history. We don't agree on policy. We don't agree on politicians. We don't agree on social issues. And then we're being separated on a bunch of different issues. The TV shows we watch, the commentators we listen to, our income levels, where we live, who we vote for, and now apparently race. So what do you think's going to happen? Do you know what divide and conquer means? Here we go. Is there a solution to the division that I believe will eventually result in conquering? I don't think so. I could go to the woke leftists and argue why I think what they're doing is wrong, and they'll just tell me I'm wrong. They'll scream, it takes one to know one. Nothing will get resolved. You can take a look at Twitter and, Twitter and YouTube. Many of these once anti-SJW types that were critical of all this stuff have now become anti-establishment. While they may not be supporting overt wokeness, they're certainly critical of those who are challenging the status quo and challenging critical race theory. And I find that outright strange. The progressive left and many of the populists, the ones who don't support this, will still line up behind it to go after Trump supporters. Well, fine. Consider a threat what you want to consider a threat. But in the end, what will happen is we will be completely divided and then we'll be conquered. Or at the very least, we just collapse and then we can see rival nations start to take over and become that superpower. The destabilization may very well lead to international conflict and war. So I don't know. I don't know if that will happen. I can't see the future. I can only tell you that I argued this is a problem. It's becoming worse. It will likely only get worse, seeing Joe Biden is rescinding Trump's executive order on critical race theory, allowing these race-based segregation to continue. And why should I assume the Democrats would do anything else? Dividing up this nation will make it easier for Democrats and corrupt politicians, Republicans included, to maintain power. So here we go. But in the end, with no unified front for America, no unified community or culture or mission, then we just get crushed. And that's where I think we're headed. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up tonight at youtube.com/TimCastIRL. It's a live show. We take your comments, we read them. So come hang out at 8 p.m. and we will see you all then.